Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Walker, Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's my pleasure to introduce our event to showcase an excellent report titled "The Struggle Against Authoritarian Influence in the Western Balkans, Montenegro as a Test Case." That's been produced by the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. In a new, profoundly more challenging global political environment that's taken shape over the past decade and a half, the rise and projection of authoritarian state power has been central to the change. Authoritarian state power is visible now at scale. It's applied through technology, information, and in the battle of ideas, among other domains, requiring democracies to mobilize on multiple fronts. This is a global phenomenon, but one that's highly relevant to the Western Balkans. As our report author Vanja Chalovic-Markovic observes, external powers, including Russia and China, are using rapidly evolving strategies to subvert democratic processes in Montenegro with patterns of influence that are visible in Southeastern Europe, but also elsewhere. Such corrosive influence presents formidable challenges to Montenegro's aspirations for European integration and more generally to the health of its democracy. This report outlines ways to address the threats to democracy. Given the evolving nature of the challenge and the autocrat's capacity to adapt, it's also crucial for civil society to possess itself the capacity to learn and adapt quickly. Such responses should enable cross-national collaboration, resource sharing, and coalition building based on common democratic aspirations. This report concludes with specific recommendations for civil society responses rooted in innovation and collaboration. At a deeper level, the report raises an important question of how the advantages that are conferred by democratic societal power can be leveraged in more effective and innovative ways in response to the corrosive authoritarian state power projection. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion with some outstanding speakers to help situate this important challenge. And before I hand things over to my colleague, Tanya Dramatsiris, I'd just like to acknowledge the excellent work of the entire team at the International Forum, including, but not limited to, Kevin Shives, Amaris Ranci, and Nicholas Nunes. And so now it's my pleasure to hand things over to my colleague, Tanya Dramatsiris.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Forum indeed for putting this event together. Speaking of the Southeast Europe, which is my preferred term for the region because it still denominates that the region is in Europe indeed, the transition to peace and democracy has been far from smooth and absolutely not yet completed. Early successes across the key reforms and reconciliations have slowed down or have completely reversed in the last decade. Leaders across the region have intensified attacks on objective media, on independent institutions, on civil society, shrinking civic space, which is critical to any functioning democracy. EU integration used to be a uniting force. Unfortunately, it is losing its appeal as many citizens across the region are realizing that unless something changes, the EU is a distant dream. Foreign illiberal influences, particularly those from Kremlin and Beijing, and Chris rightfully notes, are creating this false alternative to the European project, and they're especially abusing the chronic absence of the liberal West in this region. Through hybrid information warfare, through economic tools, corrupt practices, Kremlin and Beijing had found local proxies that are advancing their agendas and with minimum investment had effected maximum damage. Against this backdrop, a robust pro-democracy civil society of the region seems to be the only undisputed champions of the democracy. With this context in mind, please allow me to welcome the author of the report and the executive director of MANS, the organization that is at the forefront of pro-democratic fight in Montenegro and in the region, Vanja Chalovic-Markovic, who actually needs no introduction. She's a household name for any anti-corruption organization working in Europe, and a name that corrupt officials are afraid of. Vanja and her team had received threats, intimidation, pressure from the authorities, criminals, and from the public and secret police. They've been arrested, they've been interrogated, tapped, followed victims of smearing campaigns designed exclusively to silence them. Vanya and her team persevered. And they did not just persevere, they've changed the political culture in Montenegro. They've documented systemic problems, but more importantly, they found concrete solutions for reforms, putting pressure on the government, which chronically lacked the political will to tackle corruption. They affected and improved legislation in this space. They've set important restrictions and mechanisms, allowing them to exercise their watchdog role. While Montenegro still has a way to go to be a country for all of its citizens, Vanya and her team serve as a model to many civil societies across the world. Just a little less than a year and a half ago, Vanya had been decorated by the French National Order of Merit, which is the highest award presented to foreigners, as a crown for decades of her work. Turning to our guest of honor, Vanya, can you please start us off by sharing key findings from your report and particularly shedding light into innovative strategies that civil society can adopt and affect to increasingly creative authoritarians?
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you for that amazing introduction. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about Montenegro and issues in Montenegro. So, as you know, Southeast Europe holds significant geopolitical importance due to its strategic location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. While most governments in the region have adopted pro-democratic and Euro-Atlantic stance, issues like corruption and ethnic divisions persist, and far-right movements hostile to democracy remain active. Authoritarian actors exploit these vulnerabilities, often through covert influence operations. Montenegro is a NATO member and a promising candidate for EU accession. However, the country continues to struggle with corruption, organized crime infiltrating institutions, and a legacy of state capture, where government bodies served to benefit a few powerful individuals. Deep ethnic divisions, particularly regarding independence from Serbia and relations with Serbia and Russia, are further aggravated by social and democratic factors, including tensions among ethnic Montenegrins, Serbs, and others. My report explains how Russia, China, and an increasingly autocratic Serbia exploit corruption and political divisions and leverage cultural and religious ties to exert anti-democratic influence over Montenegro. It describes Serbia's role as a conduit for Russian influence, echoing Kremlin's narratives and developing new methods to sway its neighbor. For instance, the Kremlin has sought to influence Montenegrin elections by supporting pro-Russian political groups like the Democratic Front. Serbia amplifies this influence by funding pro-Serbian political parties, acquiring Montenegrin media outlets, and establishing cultural institutions that reinforce Kremlin-aligned perspectives. China also capitalizes on Montenegro's corruption and unfavorable loan agreements, portraying itself as a benevolent economic force focused on economic, scientific, and cultural collaboration, while subtly furthering its political influence. These authoritarian actors spread propaganda and manipulate information in both traditional media and online. They fund ideologically aligned cultural and religious institutions and make significant economic investments, often involving corrupt deals that bypass regulatory scrutiny. Corruption and state capture severely limit Montenegro's ability to counter the adverse effects of foreign authoritarian influence. When successful, their operations weaken democracy in Montenegro by eroding trust in fundamental institutions like the media and government, intensifying societal divisions, and undermining the protections that democracy provides to its citizens. Some would say that these operations occur globally, so why would Montenegro be any specific? Well, Montenegro, the smallest country in the Balkans, with its tiny nation of less than 1 million inhabitants, is an ideal testing ground for authoritarian influence. Because of its size, external powers can exert a disproportionate influence on Montenegro's political outcomes with relatively modest investments. Therefore, they are experimenting here with various approaches, and the lessons learned from these influence operations can be applied globally. To counter or at least reduce these threats from such powerful players, civil society must also act globally by building coalitions around shared democratic values. Since these malign actors operate with long-term strategies, we also need sustained multi-year cooperation, working together not only on individual projects, but on broader strategic plans. Our cooperation must be dynamic, enabling us to quickly respond to the constantly evolving strategies of these actors. To protect our democracies, we need to innovate, share resources more effectively, and leverage our collective knowledge to develop robust early warning systems and response plans for detecting and mitigating foreign interference. Additionally, by harnessing the capabilities of artificial intelligence technologies, NGOs can improve their ability to detect, analyze, and counteract malign foreign influence in today's digital landscape. However, many NGOs lack these capacities, making cooperation and the exchange of knowledge and tools essential. We must be able to react promptly and support one another in this challenging fight against authoritarian players who use various tactics to intimidate and silence civil society. Election periods are particularly vulnerable to influence from foreign actors, so I believe that monitoring elections should be a focus for civil society. Beyond overseeing election procedures, we should also follow the money by tracking the flow of dirty money that authoritarian actors and their proxies use to influence our democracies. This requires a more strategic and active collaboration with investigative journalists on a global scale. NGOs and journalists should work together to hold decision makers accountable for actions that enable malign foreign interference, including corruption, cronyism, and collusion. By doing so, we can jointly expose vulnerabilities within democratic institutions and pressure authorities to take actions. Authoritarian actors employ complex and ever-evolving structures to exert influence, and untangling these efforts requires significant time, resources, and dedication. Therefore, NGOs need sustained resources to engage in long-term monitoring of political, media, and social landscapes. This ongoing engagement will allow us to develop sophisticated and adaptive strategies to effectively counter authoritarian influence over time. While the challenges are substantial, through resilience, strategic cooperation, and a shared commitment to democratic values, we can make meaningful progress in countering authoritarian influence. By working together, civil society organizations can help to safeguard democratic institutions, increase accountability, and mitigate the impact of foreign interference. Although we may not eliminate these threats entirely, we can strengthen our defenses and create more robust, adaptive systems that protect and uphold the principles of democracy in a rapidly changing world.
Thank you, Vanya. That was a fascinating kind of a snapshot of a report, and we really invite everybody in the audience to take a look at concrete solutions that you just laid out. I'm going to ask you one more question before I turn over to my colleague, Kevin. Vanya, would you mind telling us a little bit more, what does a fight against foreign authoritarian influence look like in the Southeast Europe context? Especially noting that the foreign authoritarians have become very skilled and sophisticated in utilizing local context to affect their agenda. So what civil society actions can resonate there, and what really doesn't resonate? What is so context dependent that doesn't resonate?
Well, as you know, Balkans is indeed a complex region with distinct ethnic, religious, and historical factors shaping each country's identity and governance. However, one common thread unites all these countries: Foreign influence often takes roots through corrupt practices in political parties and election financing. In many Balkan nations, foreign actors leverage financial support to cultivate loyalty among specific political parties, influencing their agendas to align with the interests of these external powers rather than the people. To counter this influence, strengthening campaign financing regulations, raising public awareness, and closely monitoring financial flows in politics are, I believe, essential. These steps can limit foreign powers' ability to manipulate elections and help create a political environment where parties prioritize the needs and interests of the citizens and their voters. In the Balkans, topics can quickly become very politicized and fuel nationalist tensions, often escalating rather than resolving issues. This makes it essential to approach the fight against foreign interference in a way that transcends these divisions, exposing the realities of corruption and foreign influence in a way that resonates with all Balkan communities. Corruption is widespread throughout the region, and that is making it a powerful tool for authoritarian actors to infiltrate political systems, compromise public officials, and ultimately weaken democratic institutions. What frustrates citizens the most, on the other side, is that this corruption directly impacts their daily lives while their leaders enrich themselves. Exposing the ways foreign influence operates through corrupt practices is not just about highlighting an abstract threat. It's about protecting people's quality of life and future opportunities. When we present clear, evidence-based examples of corruption and foreign interference, specific deals, financial flows, and their tangible impacts on communities, we move the conversation beyond nationalist narratives and toward a common understanding. This approach helps people across the Balkans see the foreign influence as a shared regional threat that transcends national or ethnic boundaries. That's why I believe that cross-border journalism projects that investigate corruption and foreign influence in the Balkans are crucial in establishing a regional narrative that focuses on facts and exposes common patterns. Such projects can then collaboratively investigate and publish reports on corruption involving foreign investments in sectors like infrastructure and energy, which disproportionately benefit authoritarian actors. Similarly, cross-border cooperation among watchdog organizations to monitor and report on foreign investments, corrupt practices, and their impact can create a consistent source of information for the public, grounding this discussion in facts rather than nationalist rhetoric. For example, NGOs in Balkan could create a shared data platform tracking foreign investments in critical sectors like energy, transportation, and media, highlighting ties between foreign entities and local decision makers. This would provide a comprehensive, accessible view of how foreign influence operates through corruption across the region, empowering citizens to demand accountability. The fight against foreign influence and corruption in the Balkans requires more than isolated efforts. It demands a coordinated regional approach rooted in transparency and collaboration. Ultimately, this fight is not just about limiting foreign influence. It's about safeguarding the Balkans' potential for prosperity and democracy.
Thank you, Vanya, so much. I'm now turning over conversation to my colleague Kevin Shives to continue guiding us through this rich conversation.
Great. Thank you so excuse me. Thank you so much, Tanya and Vanya, for both of your contributions and what you highlighted. Vanya, you talked about deals bypassing regulatory scrutiny. It's something I'd love to get into with our panelists. And we really wanted to at the forum talk about Southeast Europe's perspective on this because of the strong civic traditions that are there, represented by your organization, of course, and many others. And thank you for talking again about the importance of monitoring some of these elements. It sounds like that the Southeastern Europe context is really quite a hotbed of this issue of authoritarian influence. I'd like to bring in two experts from organizations now who offer us the perspective of translating these insights from the European context into a more global one, and addressing in particular the impacts that the PRC and Kremlin's influence have on global democracy, and also how global strategies to combating foreign authoritarian influence are faring. Martin Halle is the founder and director of Synopsis, a China-focused research institution based in Prague, Czech Republic. Synopsis and other institutions within the Czech Republic have not only made important impacts in addressing the ways in which the PRC and its state-affiliated enterprises have captured elites and corroded important institutions within the Czech Republic, something detailed by us in the Forum and the journal Democracy in recent years, but he and his organization are now working to translate those successes into other country and regional contexts as well. We're also joined by Martin Vladimirov, our second but equally impressive Martin. He is the director of the Energy and Climate Program at the Center for the Study of Democracy, a European public policy institute based in Sofia, Bulgaria. Martin has also been exploring the threat from the malign Russian economic influence over the past decade, co-authoring the Kremlin Playbook series that originated in the European context, but has now been expanded to Latin America and African context. So let's start with Martin Halle. Martin, the report outlines some of the economic tools that China uses to influence a small country in Southeast Europe. But looking a bit more broadly, what is your assessment of the impact of this emerging authoritarian influence on democratic institutions in the wider Eastern European region? What troubles you about these trends in Eastern Europe?
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. And first and foremost, I would like to congratulate the author on an excellent report. Now, back to your question, the push from the People's Republic of China into Eastern Europe started in bulk with the creation of the 16+1 grouping in 2012. Under the banner of economic diplomacy. So economic diplomacy was the main slogan that was used for the initial penetration of Eastern Europe. The main carrots were the supposed economic benefits from closer cooperation with the People's Republic of China. There were wide expectations of large-scale Chinese investment, growth in trade, and things like that. But in the end, in retrospect, we can see that much of this was only an effort to create perception of this economic largesse from the People's Republic of China. But in reality, the actual outcomes were quite slim, and in many cases, the investment inflows that did realize were actually directed to specific individuals or specific institutions, contributing to the problem of elite capture. So in a lot of cases, this economic diplomacy, in fact, on the ground, really meant elite capture. And in some smaller countries in the region, like Montenegro, for instance, elite capture could mean state capture because the elites are rather limited in numbers, as are the nations as a whole. So these trends persist in some countries, and in some countries in Eastern Europe, they have been entirely discredited, like, for instance, in the Czech Republic. But it seems that in some other countries, they seem to persist, and that, of course, is a concern. Thanks.
Maybe I could ask a quick follow-up of you. Vanya talked a little bit about that these are not broad abstract. It's not a broad abstract threat of foreign authoritarian influence, but in fact have tangible impacts on the quality of life for communities. You talk about elite capture and state capture. Translate that for impact, if you could, in terms of what that means in a place like the Czech Republic or elsewhere on sort of the quality of life or economic development or some of these core concerns of citizens and communities. What sort of impacts might that have on everyday quality of life issues?
The impact can indeed be very palpable. So first and foremost, it's the decline in democratic governance. So, elite capture by definition leads to institutional capture. So essentially, the autocratic powers, and China in particular in this case, can abuse the institutions of democratic governance and turn them against their original purpose, just by capturing the leadership of these institutions. And we have seen that for a couple of years in the Czech Republic, when some of the institutions that were supposed to guarantee, for instance, a fair economic competition, were turned on their head and didn't function as they should, which of course then had real life consequences. Another direct consequence is the limitations that usually come with this sort of interference on free speech. We have seen efforts at limiting the freedom of expression, pressure on specific media, pressure on organizations like ours, lawfare that was trying to prevent people from expressing their ideas openly. So the impact could be very, very real.
Thank you so much. I want to bring in Martin Vladimirov now, who I think might have a unique perspective on an issue that Vanya raised about how some of these authoritarian powers have bypassed regulatory structures and procedures. Martin, could you expound on that a little bit more about what that's looked like, either within the Bulgarian context or more broadly, of how these sort of special deals have been increasing and what kind of impact that might have as well?
Thank you so much, Kevin, and congratulations, Vanya, for a great report and for all your work and your organization has been doing. Just to give credit to Mans for their great help. I remember in 2016, we were citing many of the investigations when we were developing our Kremlin playbook in Montenegro section of the report. And I mean, you have done great work in kind of showing how the Russians operate on the ground. So thanks for that. On your question, Kevin, I think the Kremlin playbook, the Kremlin strategy around the world is very similar. The Russians are not very creative. They take advantage of governance deficits within key institutions like regulatory bodies to lock in strategic sectors and lock in state-owned companies, for example, in asymmetric long-term relationships, economic deals, where economic feasibility, cost-benefit assessment, social acceptance, political consensus are ignored because the goal of regulatory institutions is to push through the deal even when it doesn't make sense. And in this way, basically providing preferential treatment for a Russian actor, a Russian company, or a domestic intermediary. So we usually talk about partners of crime. So Russian companies and Russian entities and local oligarchic structures working together to circumvent proper regulatory procedures. And I would give, the report, Vanya did mention several deals in Montenegro, but I would say this is a global phenomenon. I'll give an example from the Kremlin playbook in Latin America, which we just published. There, Rosatom, the state-owned Russian nuclear company, started building a nuclear facility together with the local state-owned energy company without any parliamentary decision on this major project, $300 million, which is quite a lot of money for the Bolivian state. So it was a state-funded project, but there was no parliamentary approval of that. There was no cost-benefit assessment. So a whole nuclear regulator was created on purpose for this deal to pass through. But guess what? After the deal got stuck, after the the loss of the election of Evo Morales, the then president and leader of the MAS party, Rosatom activated 1,000 election doctors, or witch doctors, I don't know exactly the term, who created a vicious campaign that was against the successor of MAS, and were able to actually help topple this government and bring back MAS to power. And after MAS came back to power, the project went through. It was accelerated and it's being built as we speak now. So leveraging a large-scale deal to achieve not only economic influence, and long-term economic lock-in, but also achieve political leverage is one of the key elements of the Kremlin playbook. And you can see that in Africa, you can see that in Europe, all over the place. But how can we counter that? We need stronger institutions on the ground, because in the end of the day, it's our own governance deficits that are being exploited.
Thank you so much for painting a pretty clear picture of how that looks in the Russian context. Within the China context, one thing I've heard a lot from different contacts in this field and from civil society organizations is the growth of essentially what are termed strategic national project exceptions, or to where these big infrastructure projects kind of bypass regulatory scrutiny and undo so many of the protections, the rights, and the guardrails that many civil society organizations and governments have developed over the years, whether they relate to labor rights, environmental rules, etc. It's certainly a pernicious problem from a variety of perspectives as well. I want to follow up just with you one more time, Martin Vladimirov, and also bring in Vanya on a question. This report talks not only about the role of Russia and China as powers that influence and interfere with domestic practices, but also Serbia enacting as a Russian influence amplifier, essentially, in places like Montenegro. Where have you seen this tactic with other liberal governments in the region? What does that look like from the perspective of the particular issues that Serbia brings up in this context? Let's start with Martin Vladimirov and then Vanya as well.
Well, this is a great question. And indeed, Russia now does not act alone. It works through an axis of different authoritarian powers, not only in the Balkans, but also across the world, in Africa, in Latin America. I'll give again an example from Latin America, because I think it's a very fresh example, which is Venezuela, where Russia and Iran have partnered very closely in backing the regime of Maduro. On the one side, by bringing enough, kind of oil-related equipment so that the state-owned Venezuelan oil company can keep on refining oil and exporting it around the world. So without the Iranian support here, this would not have been possible. In exchange, the Venezuelan regime has provided Iran with a safe haven for Hezbollah fighters that have been training in Venezuela. And also there is a growing Iranian media influence in Venezuela and in some other left-wing governments throughout the region, which was very, very surprising to me when we look how Russian media propaganda and Iranian media propaganda colluding now on one and the same message, which is basically criticizing American imperialism, liberal consensus, etc., all the narratives that are landing on a very fertile ground there.
Thank you so much. This is something, this sort of phenomenon of autocracy, Inc., or the cooperation of local liberal governments and international influencing powers like Russia and China, is something that the forum has researched and a number of people have researched. My colleague will put in the chat or put on the YouTube channel afterwards a recent report on how this works in the information space in Latin America as well. Vanya, talk a little bit about your perspective of the role of Serbia specifically in this subregion. What does that look like in that context? What's particular about Serbia's role?
I think first that the interests of Serbia and Russia when it comes to influencing Montenegro are overlapping. Then having in mind Serbian geopolitical relations with Serbia, it became kind of logical that after 2016, when Russian influence in Montenegrin elections became extremely visible and noted at a global level, that Russia will change their strategy and try to use more covert operations. What we noticed through time is that basically more or less the very same structures, not only political structures, but even civil society organizations or different kind of other entities in the country are used by both Russia in the past and then Serbia, and these capacities that were carefully developed by Russian institutions in the period of around 2016 were then built on further by Serbia. So we are seeing Serbia Serbia buying media in Montenegro and heavily influencing the local narratives. We see them developing new tools to support the civil society organizations that are promoting their narratives. The church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, is one of the major players in these influences, and of course the political parties that have frequent interactions with the Serbian authorities. What we also see is that Serbia is taking over some of the approaches related to China influence, like cooperation with state-owned companies in businesses which are not favorable for the Montenegrin side, and that since China is present in both of the countries, we are seeing very similar operations when it comes to that area. So it is confirming that the foreign influence is evolving, that as soon as you figure out the way that they are approaching your system and try to free up the system from their influence, they come up with new strategies, and that is one of the reasons why civil society have to be able to respond promptly, and most of all, to identify these strategies as soon as possible before they make bigger damage.
Thanks so much. You picked up on an issue of a question we actually have from the audience of talking about the rise of illiberal CSOs throughout this region, whether they're government organized, NGOs in the traditional sense, or more grassroots religious and social organizations that also serve some of these illiberal agendas. Can you go deeper on this issue, perhaps of religious institutions or others that are attached to the state, and how that might impact a place like Montenegro? I imagine if you're sort of a normal citizen, you don't get these subtle differences between government organized NGOs and truly independent NGOs. Talk a little bit more deeply about that, if you could.
Of course, first, I think that Russia and now Serbia also recognized how they can use civil society and how they can use NGOs in order to not only influence the public in Montenegro, but also to hide trails of their finances. Because political parties that were receiving foreign funding were under much stronger magnifying glass, especially after 2016. And that's when we noticed a number of these NGOs popping up around the country and promoting whether Serbian or Russian language and culture. In addition to that, there is a number of organizations established by whether Serbia or in most cases Russia, or with close links with them, which are promoting different narratives, starting from, and not only in Montenegro, which have these activities, which are obviously not only involving Balkan countries, but going much further into the Europe, where they are networking, where they are promoting their beliefs, and where they are obviously interacting with their counterparts from Russia. Finally, when it comes to the church, the role of the church became increasingly important following 2020 elections, where a long-lasting government changed, and where the church had an important role in these political changes. Therefore, that strengthened their impact as well on political sphere in Montenegro, which was heavily influenced, depending on different interpretations, but whether by Serbia or also by Russia. In that situation, in such a small country and divided society, as we mentioned, with so much information being provided to the citizens from these channels that are controlled by whether Serbia or Russia, the political parties that are sharing that narrative are, of course, being given additional support that cannot be valued in money or in funds as before. So the way that influence is happening is becoming more sophisticated, and more intangible factors are involved. Therefore, it is even more complicated to explain to ordinary citizen what is actually happening in a country and why these foreign interferences are having such a harmful effects at the democracy.
Thank you very much. And if others in the audience have a question, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A chat. We'll see if we can weave them into the conversation. Martin Vladimirov talked a little bit about the sort of pattern of Russian impact and influence outside of the European context. Specifically, he's talked about Latin America a bit. We referenced recently from the China perspective these strategic national projects. You talked about elite capture within the European context. I know Synopsis has begun to work outside of the European context as well and look at these issues from a global perspective, hopefully translating some of these successes that you've had within the Czech Republic elsewhere. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen about China's pattern of authoritarian influence globally? What are you beginning to see as you're looking at this issue more deeply in other regions outside of Europe?
Thanks. Thank you. We have in fact been working globally from the very beginning in terms of research, because as has already been said, this is a global phenomenon. You cannot really understand it fully within the constraints of a nation state. So you always have to look beyond your immediate environment and compare your experience with others. So from the very beginning, we practiced something that we called network research. We work with similar institutions and like-minded researchers, essentially globally. But now we also do some more policy work and organization work outside of the immediate region. And the basic lesson that we've learned is that the playbook, so to speak, that is used by the Communist Party of China is the same or very similar around the world, with some local modification based on the local context. But of course, the local context and the local situation differs significantly from place to place. So things are viewed differently from different places, and the civil society and the society at large is also structured somewhat differently in different places, which makes up for some, often quite significant differences in the approach that local civil society organizations take to these issues. So, for instance, in places like Latin America, the geopolitical aspects are seen very differently, for instance, from Eastern Europe. Also, the historical experience of a region like Latin America is very different from Eastern Europe, which then informs the activities of some of the local actors. So when you approach other regions, you need to keep these differences and potential differences in mind. Now, we've recently also started working in the South Pacific, and there's this one thing that has been of much concern to me, and that is that in the South Pacific, where we can see a very similar push into the region by the PRC and the CCP that we have seen into Eastern Europe a decade ago, there is a significant difference in that. Whereas the push into Eastern Europe was performed under the banner of economic diplomacy. In the South Pacific, a significant part of the package that Beijing is pushing is actually security cooperation, which I personally find quite disturbing. This is something that we didn't see in Eastern Europe 10 years ago. The security and in fact any political issues were actually avoided studiously, and this was natural because any mention of security in an environment like Eastern Europe with the reminiscences of the communist years would have immediately raised alarms. So it was a no-go in Eastern Europe, but it's now very much present. It's very much pushed openly in the South Pacific. It's to me, it's a new phenomenon and a disturbing one.
Yes, certainly. And in a place like the South Pacific, you don't have quite the level of civic activism and traditions that Southeast Europe has benefited from over the last 30 or 40 years at least. So want to talk a little bit about, move this conversation from sort of threats and impacts to one more towards response and resilience, and what this looks like from a civil society perspective, obviously drawing on the lessons of Southeast Europe, but applying them globally as well. Martin Vladimirov, could you talk a little bit about some alliance building and advocacy lessons that might enhance civil society responses to authoritarian influence? How are you doing this now with civil society, media, or other government actors in the regions? Or are there any particular elements of Vanya's report that you feel like could be replicated globally?
Thank you. I think Vanya mentions in her report very eloquently how we need to work within regional coalitions and regional alliances between NGOs and investigative journalists, and how networks and a network approach towards exposing corruption practices related to authoritarian influence is much more impactful and efficient in bringing more policy attention to the issue. I'll be even more direct, and I'll be a bit cynical based on our recent experience over the past 2.5 years, trying to kind of expose sanctions loopholes related to Russian oil and gas. We need to create media storms in a way to embarrass, through our research, through our investigations, embarrass policymakers, not only in places which are violating, for example, sanctions or enabling Russian or Chinese influence, but also in the West, in Brussels, in DC, where there is very often lack of enough attention to some of these, ongoing practices, and which are very public sometimes, very obvious, but because of lack of policy attention, because there's so many priorities at the same time, these issues don't really reach a level of decision making in Brussels and in DC that can affect, reflect back on domestic policymakers. So in a way, what I mean by influence kind of operation is that you try to amplify the impact of your research and your investigations through international media outlets who flag, some of these issues, and you can bring them then to high-level policymakers saying, okay, look, this is happening under your watch. What can you do about it? And you bring concrete proposals, very clear, very simple proposals in a way, so that they are more actionable. And I don't want to brag, but what CSD was trying to do over the past 2 years, for example, with the case of Lukoil in Southeastern Europe, is preventing the import of Russian oil in the region, was basically showing something that was happening in front of us, laundering of Russian oil in the value of $3 billion. In the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot of money for Russia, maybe, but it was a vital way of stopping flows in a vulnerable regions, and no one paid attention, neither in Brussels nor in DC. We raised the issue, we explain it in a data-driven manner so that it becomes convincing, and so policymakers in the West acted. They reached out to domestic policymakers in Southeast Europe, asking, why are you guys keep doing that? You don't need to do it. There is this evidence, there is this data analysis showing that you don't need to buy any more Russian oil. So all of your narratives are actually Russian propaganda in a way. And it was successful. So Russian oil imports were stopped. So this kind of micro, in a way, operations might be very successful in pushing through some of this authoritarian, pushing back some of this authoritarian influence.
Thank you for bringing that up and for going into such detail about what a media store might look like. Martin Hollis, Synopsis, really, I've heard you talk about this before. You've had a strong record of publishing and working with local Czech media to expose CCP influence. For the benefit of other civic actors that be listening today, what lessons have you learned in working with journalists and media outlets that others might glean from your successes or failures as well?
Well, thanks. The media work is absolutely crucial, and I think the main lesson that we've learned is that you have to go beyond your comfort zone, and sometimes do the kind of work that normally a CSO or think tank or an academic institution would not be expected to do. In other words, you cannot simply leave this aspect to the media themselves. Very often they're not quite ready to pick it up. Especially in some of the smaller societies like those in Eastern Europe, the media are in deeper crisis even than elsewhere. These are small languages, the markets are smaller, they're cash strapped, they're under a lot of financial pressure. They cannot afford to keep area specialists on their stuff. Very often even the bigger papers would have like 1 or 2 persons on the foreign desks, and neither of them might be an area specialist, for instance, for Eurasia or for East Asia or for something like that. So very often they're ill prepared to deal with this challenge, which is enormous. So they need outside help. They need specialists like ourselves. And very often, especially in the beginning, the cooperation is somewhat one-sided. So you need to do the work yourself. So, when we started out, I expected that we would just cooperate with journalists and give them stories, help them analyze things, sometimes give them language support for languages they don't know. But in the end, or rather in the beginning, we actually had to write most of the stuff ourselves. So you have to, on occasion, you have to become a journalist yourself, and not only that, but you have to become an investigative journalist, because very often you have to do the kind of work that's like I said, that normally think tankers or academics or CSO workers would not be asked to do. So you better be prepared for that.
I think your point about civil society experts or research experts being able to supplement the lack of foreign affairs knowledge within a lot of media organizations. Obviously, if it's true in Europe, it's definitely true in many other regions as well, with less of a sort of a regular reporting on foreign affairs interests. A lot of these media outlets are very domestic geared as well. And so being able to provide that expertise, whether it's from the China perspective, Russia perspective, or just more general perspective, is absolutely critical. I want to turn to Vanya and pick up on one of the particular conclusions of her report. She talked about having a rapidly evolving early warning system and response plan. How would you envisage, Vanya, from your perspective, your local perspective, a systemic response that might help a civil society organization like yours anticipate these shifting threats? How would an organization like yours in Montenegro benefit from such a more globalized early warning system of sorts?
Well, now, thank you for this question. We were talking quite a few times today about the Kremlin playbook. I think that it's time for a civil society playbook. I think it would be extremely useful if NGOs like the one I'm coming from, in the smaller countries with limited resources and access to information and capacities, would be able to benefit from what our colleagues already did in other countries. So I think it would be useful to establish some kind of a collaborative information sharing platform that would include real-time data collection and monitoring tools to track suspicious financial flows, media and online narratives, political activities, and other indicators of foreign interference. By centralizing key data, case studies, documents on these activities, CSOs could reference concrete examples of malign practices as they emerge, without spending a lot of time to collect information about similar practices in other countries, especially if these are some of the new strategies that foreign actors are employing. Such a platform could also leverage technology-driven tools like artificial intelligence and data analytics, which can quickly process and analyze vast amounts of data and detect patterns and identify emerging threats before they fully materialize. Once the threat is detected, CSOs would need a structured response plan that includes mechanisms for swift action, simply saying a civil society playbook, which would give us some ideas on what worked in different countries, what we can use in order to counter these particular strategies, what experiences and knowledge we can benefit from other countries to convince our citizens how harmful is this foreign interference. A clear, structured response plan also should enable organization to mobilize quickly not only local resources, but also colleagues from other countries, experts from other countries. So I think it would be useful to have some kind of interactive system which would allow us on one side to more promptly identify the threat, to collect data about that threat and collect data about responses of our colleagues in other countries. For a small organization in a country like Montenegro with really limited human resources, this systemic response would provide access to critical data, to technology and partnerships that would otherwise be beyond our reach.
Thank you so much, and for the specificity of this type of idea as well. I think what you're calling for is a little bit more in-depth, data-driven, and comprehensive than what we've developed here at the forum. But one thing my colleague will put in the chat is a link to a website we call sharppower.org that collects a lot of the research, news, analysis, and response efforts done by civil society organizations and just general reporting by media and institutions about the phenomenon of global authoritarian influence. It catalogs it by country, catalogs it by sector, and also by authoritarian influencer as well. And it certainly could be a very small down payment on this type of early warning system, or a way for local civil society organizations just to get a little bit of a feel of what this looks like in their region or in other regions that might have parallels to their own national context. The last question I want to bring out is maybe if you could just provide a very short response, Vanya, is from the question in the chat about the role of the EU and how the EU accession process has helped your work in countering corruption and foreign authoritarian influence. Where has that been a benefit or potentially not as well? So Vanya, if you could, for maybe 1 minute at most.
When it comes to fight against corruption, the EU accession was more beneficial. When it comes to foreign interference, not much. I think that the EU has a crucial role and could really standardize, set a unified framework for election security, first of all, some standards for cybersecurity measures and regulatory framework. And that could be then the model for the Balkans, because there is simply not enough political will in these countries to do it ourselves. I think that the EU should engage much more in countering foreign interference online, especially having in mind that the Balkans is a black dot when it comes to access to information about online advertisements of political parties. And I really think that their role should be more active when it comes to setting some standards that countries in the accession process need to comply with.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to give each of our panelists 30 seconds at most to say there's one takeaway that you want people who are listening today to have. Let us know. So let's start with Martin Halle, and then Martin Vladimirov, and then Vanya. One final key takeaway, if you could, 20, 30 seconds at most. Go.
Well, I'm not sure if I can make it in 20 seconds, but the one thing that I would like to emphasize again is that the challenge is enormous, and civil society organizations that work on this challenge need to be prepared to go outside their normal scope of work. I think that's probably the one thing that we should remember, and we should be prepared for.
Super. Thank you so much. Martin Vladimirov?
I think that we need to keep on the good work of exposing different state capture and corruption risks that are taken advantage by Russia and China, because especially outside of Europe, in the current context of a global South that is swinging between support for Russia and the West, there is little awareness of how Russia actually undermines democracy and democratic institutions in these countries. There is little awareness, and that's why these regions have become so vulnerable. Unfortunately, I think for now, both Russia and China are winning this kind of global narrative debate. So we need to step up our efforts in exposing this strategy.
Thank you. Vanya, thank you for your report. A final word from you if you want.
Well, I think it takes a network to counter the network. So I think since they act globally, we need to act globally. Since they evolve, we need to evolve. And I really think that the opportunity we have ahead of us is in the fact that we didn't use all these collaborative methods that we could, and that is the opportunity for the future to change the influence, at least in some of the countries.
Thank you so much. I love how earlier you called for a civil society playbook to the Kremlin playbook. So I encourage everyone to read the report and, of course, share it with your own personal or social networks. Again, if our community is not sharing our lessons learned and identifying new trends, then we're running behind and we are running blind. So check out the QR code that's going to be put up on the screen right now, or go to ned.org/ideas to download the report. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for our panelists, Tanya, Chris, Martin, and Vanya, for such an enriching conversation and specific one as well. Thank you all.